I'm not proud of most of what I'm about to write, and I'm definitely not looking for sympathy. I'm putting this here because it's been rattling around in my head for years, and maybe getting it out will finally quiet it down. Smuggling across the border is one flight I still replay in my head, over and over, usually at 3 in the morning when sleep won't stick. I'll call myself William, because I don't need my real name tied to this, and because some parts of my life feel like they belong to someone else anyway. At the time, I wasn't some criminal mastermind or hardened outlaw. I was just broke, angry, and convinced I was smarter than the system. I'd spent years telling myself I was unlucky rather than irresponsible, that the world owed me something for all the near misses and half failures. The crime didn't start as a grand plan, it started as a quiet, dangerous idea whispered between beers and bad decisions. One flight. One job. In and out. That's what I told myself. The circumstances were almost boring in how ordinary they were. Rent overdue. A job that barely covered groceries. A friend of a friend who said, "It's easy money," and smiled in a way that should have warned me. I knew crossing that line meant I'd never quite see myself the same way again, but at the time, that felt abstract. Consequences always do, until they're sitting next to you at 30,000 feet with your heart pounding so loud you're sure everyone can hear it. That flight wasn't the first bad thing I ever did, but it was the first one that made me feel like I'd stepped into a different version of my life. The kind where you don't get to pretend anymore. And that's where this story really begins. The thing about bad ideas is they rarely announce themselves as bad. This one showed up dressed as a solution. I was sitting in the back of a dive bar with a guy named Marcus, again, not his real name, someone I barely knew but trusted way too quickly because he listened when I complained. I was venting about money, about how every step forward felt like it came with a bill attached. He nodded along, let me run out of steam, then casually said, "You ever think about making real money? Like fast money?" I laughed at first. Everyone thinks they've got a shortcut. But he didn't push. He let the silence do the work. Then he mentioned a flight, a border crossing, and how most people never get looked at twice. No violence. No weapons. Just carrying something from point A to point B. He said it like he was describing a grocery run. What got me wasn't greed, not exactly. It was the idea that I could fix everything in one move. One choice that would reset my life. I told myself it was temporary, that this wasn't who I was, just something I was doing. I even framed it as practical, almost responsible. That's how you know you're lying to yourself. You start dressing recklessness up as logic. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the money landing in my account, the relief of breathing without that constant pressure in my chest. I also imagined getting caught, cuffs snapping shut, my mother getting a phone call she'd never forget. Somehow, the first image felt more real than the second. That imbalance should have stopped me. Instead, it nudged me forward. By morning, the idea wasn't just an idea anymore. It felt inevitable. I didn't officially agree right away. That's another lie I told myself, that hesitation meant morality was still in the room. In reality, I'd already decided. Everything after was just me easing into it slowly so I wouldn't feel the drop. Marcus texted me details and fragments. Not enough to be incriminating, just enough to keep me hooked. Dates without times. Cities without addresses. Commercial flight, he said, like that was supposed to calm me down. You'll blend in. Nobody looks twice at people who look like they belong. I stared at my phone longer than I should have, rereading those messages until the words lost their meaning. I remember pacing my apartment, stepping over piles of unopened mail, thinking about how thin the line was between the life I had and the one he was offering. All I had to do was cross it. I justified it in 100 quiet ways. I wasn't hurting anyone directly. I wasn't forcing anything. If I didn't do it, someone else would. That one was my favorite, outsourcing my guilt to an imaginary replacement version of myself. When I finally typed, "Okay," it felt anticlimactic. No thunder. No surge of adrenaline. Just 3 letters sent into the void. But once they were gone, something shifted. The world didn't look different, but I did. I was suddenly aware of how much I had to lose, which somehow made me more determined to win. That night, I slept hard for the first time in weeks. Looking back, that might have been the calmest moment of the whole thing, the last stretch of ignorance before preparation turned the idea into something real, tangible, and dangerous. Preparation didn't look like blueprints or burner phones like in the movies. It was quieter, more mundane, which somehow made it scarier. Marcus finally called me instead of texting. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if he were explaining how to assemble IKEA furniture. He told me what to wear, what not to bring, how to answer questions if anyone asked. Short sentences. No room for curiosity. The biggest part of the prep was pretending nothing was happening. I went to work, made small talk, laughed at jokes I didn't hear. Inside, I was running checklists on a loop. Passport location. Boarding pass. Carry-on size. Facial expressions. I practiced looking relaxed in the mirror, which sounds ridiculous until you realize how much fear shows up on your face when you're not paying attention. I cleaned my apartment like I was leaving for good. Took out the trash. Did laundry. Backed up my laptop. Little acts that felt like insurance against some unnamed disaster. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I told myself it was for their protection, but really, I couldn't stand the idea of someone looking at me differently before it was over. The night before the flight, Marcus dropped off the package. Not at my place, never that careless. It was smaller than I expected, sealed and wrapped in a way that made it feel heavier than it probably was. He didn't explain much, just reminded me not to open it and not to panic. "You're just carrying a bag," he said. "That's it." I nodded like I understood, even though my hands were shaking. Up until then, everything had been theoretical. Once that package was in my possession, the crime had weight, shape, consequences. And there was no backing out without admitting, at least to myself, that I was in way deeper than I ever planned to be. Airports have a way of making everyone feel small and interchangeable, which is exactly what I was counting on. I got there early, way earlier than necessary, because sitting still at home felt impossible. Every sound was too loud, every thought too sharp. At least at the airport, anxiety blended in. Everyone there is nervous about something. I remember standing in the security line, staring at the back of a stranger's jacket, trying not to think about what was in my bag. It felt like it had its own gravity, pulling my attention back to it every few seconds. I kept expecting alarms to go off just because my heart was racing. That's not how it works, obviously, but fear doesn't care about logic. Security was almost insulting in how normal it was. Shoes off. Belt in the bin. A board agent waving me forward without making eye contact. I wanted them to stop me, just a little, so the tension could break. Instead, I walked through clean, untouched, carrying something that could wreck my life while nobody noticed a thing. At the gate, I watched people board ahead of me, families, couples, solo travelers glued to their phones. I tried to imagine what they'd think if they knew what I was doing, if they'd see me as dangerous or just pathetic. When my group was called, my legs felt heavy, like they were lagging behind my intentions. Stepping onto the plane was the point of no return. Once that cabin door closed, there would be no casual exits, no pretending this was just a bad idea I could laugh off later. I found my seat, stowed my bag carefully, and buckled in. As the plane pushed back from the gate, I felt a jolt of adrenaline so sharp it almost hurt. That was the moment it hit me. I wasn't just planning a crime anymore. I was in it. Once we were in the air, the adrenaline didn't fade like I expected. It settled into something colder, heavier. The kind of fear that doesn't spike, just sits there and presses on your chest. The seatbelt sign dinged off, people relaxed, drinks started rolling down the aisle. Meanwhile, I was hyper-aware of every movement I made, like I'd forgotten how to exist normally. I'd barely touched the bag under the seat in front of me, terrified that drawing attention to it would somehow make it obvious. Every time someone stood up, I tracked them until they sat back down. Every laugh from a flight attendant sounded fake to me, like it was covering something else. I kept thinking, they know. They don't know how yet, but they know. The guy next to me tried to make small talk. Asked if I was heading home or away. I don't even remember what I said, just that my voice sounded too steady, like I'd rehearsed it. That scared me more than if I'd stuttered. It meant I was slipping into the role, becoming someone who could lie without flinching. Turbulence hit about halfway through. Nothing major, just enough to rattle the cabin. People gripped armrests, joked nervously. I felt my stomach drop for a different reason. For a split second, I imagined the bag bursting open, imagined everything spilling out in front of strangers. Completely irrational, but fear doesn't need permission to spiral. I stared out the window at clouds that looked soft and harmless, thinking about how detached everything felt. Life was happening normally all around me, snacks, announcements, polite smiles, while I was silently crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Up there, suspended between borders, I realized something unsettling. Part of me was enjoying it. Not the risk exactly, but the intensity. The clarity. For once, nothing else in my life mattered. Bills, regrets, future plans, they all vanished, replaced by a single goal: land the plane and walk off like nothing happened. The wheels hitting the runway should have felt like relief. Instead, it triggered a whole new wave of panic. The plane slowed, people clapped softly like this was just another successful trip, and all I could think was, now it actually matters. In the air, everything had felt suspended, like the consequences were on pause. On the ground, they were waiting. I stayed seated longer than necessary, pretending to check my phone while my heart hammered. I rehearsed the walk in my head: stand, grab bag, move with the crowd, don't rush, don't lag. Normal. Be aggressively normal. When I finally stood, my legs felt rubbery, like they might fold if I thought about them too much. The jet bridge smelled like recycled air and impatience. I followed the stream of bodies toward passport control, every step louder in my head than the last. Signs pointed the way, calm and authoritative, like nothing bad had ever happened under them. That contrast messed with me more than anything. I caught my reflection in a glass panel. Same face, same clothes, but my eyes looked different. Sharper. Older. I remember thinking, if I get through this, I'm not going back to who I was before. And that scared me almost as much as getting caught. Passport control was just a series of ropes and quiet dread. The line crawled forward in inches, every shuffle of feet stretching time thinner. I kept my eyes ahead, not because I was confident, but because I was afraid that if I looked around, someone would notice how tightly wound I was. My hands were dry, then suddenly slick, then dry again. I wiped them on my jeans like that meant something. I listened to the conversations in front of me: tour plans, complaints about jet lag, a kid asking for the bathroom. Normal life, broadcast at low volume. Each time a passport stamped, the sound landed in my chest like a dropped weight. Thump. Next. Thump. Next. When it was my turn, the officer barely looked up at first. Took my passport, scanned it, asked the standard questions. Where are you coming from? How long are you staying? I answered without embellishment, which felt safer than any clever story. My voice stayed steady, but my pulse was out of control. I was sure it would give me away. He paused longer than I liked, typed something, frowned, not at me, just at his screen. Seconds stretched. Then he stamped the passport and slid it back. Welcome, he said, already calling the next person. I walked away on autopilot, breath shallow, realizing I'd crossed the border, but not the fear. If passport control was a test of nerves, baggage claim was a test of patience. It's a strange limbo, everyone pretending they're not watching the same conveyor belt with desperate intensity. I leaned against a pillar and tried to look bored, like I'd done this 100 times. Inside, I was counting seconds, measuring exits, cataloging uniforms. The carousel started with a mechanical groan. Suitcases thudded out one by one, strangers stepping forward to claim pieces of their lives. Every time someone reached for a bag near mine, my shoulders tensed. I imagined the wrong hands grabbing it, a zipper catching, questions starting. None of that happened, but the images didn't stop coming. A guy in a security vest walked past, talking into a radio. I froze, then forced myself to breathe. He didn't slow down. Didn't look at me. Just another reminder that most of the time, nobody's paying attention unless you give them a reason. When my bag finally appeared, I lifted it like it weighed nothing, even though it felt heavier than ever. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. I just walked. Each step away from that carousel felt earned, like I was carrying more than luggage. I was carrying proof that I'd made it this far. Once I pushed through the sliding doors into the open air, the city felt both enormous and empty. Taxis honked, people talked on phones, a bus rattled past, and somehow, none of it touched me. I was alive in a way that was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Every normal noise felt like it belonged to someone else's life. My heart was still racing, and I had to remind myself that this freedom, this daylight, was real. I walked slowly, dragging the bag beside me, letting the crowd swallow me. The adrenaline from the flight was mutating into a sharp awareness. Every shadow could hide a threat, every glance could mean recognition. I realized that my planning had worked, at least so far. I hadn't been searched, questioned, or caught. But I couldn't laugh, couldn't relax. I found a quiet corner near a cafe, sat down, and finally let myself breathe. It was intoxicating, that mix of fear and victory. For the first time in weeks, I felt control, but it was a fragile kind. The kind that whispers, "Don't screw this up now." And I knew deep down that the hardest part wasn't the flight, it was what came after. Sitting on that curb, I finally let the fear and adrenaline collide, and it hit me all at once. I was alone with what I'd done. Nobody knew, nobody would ask, but I couldn't shake the sense that the moment I looked around, the world could tilt and expose me. The bag beside me was more than a package, it was a symbol of every choice that led me here. I replayed the entire flight in my head, the security line, the eyes of the passport officer, the carousel, even the taxi horns outside. Every decision, every small nod to caution, suddenly felt monumental. The thought of being caught, even after making it this far, gnawed at me. I realized that the thrill of success didn't erase guilt, it only made it quieter, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I kept checking my surroundings like a habitual criminal, even though nothing was happening. People passed, completely unaware, and I envied them for that ignorance. But envy quickly turned to self-loathing. Part of me hated how easy it had been. The weight wasn't just in the bag. It was in me, in every heartbeat that reminded me I was responsible for stepping over a line I couldn't unstep. By the time I found a quiet hotel room to stash myself and the bag, the adrenaline had started to wear off, leaving something heavier behind. Triumph, in its rawest form, felt more like guilt. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small duffel, and realized that the flight, the border, even the plan, it wasn't the hard part. The hard part was living with it afterward. I kept imagining someone noticing the bag, someone questioning me, someone looking too closely at my face. Every little noise outside the room made me jump. I wanted to call Marcus, but I didn't. That call would mean accountability, and accountability was terrifying. Instead, I stayed silent, tracing patterns on the carpet with my finger, letting my mind twist the night into worst-case scenarios. Sleep came in short bursts, dreamless. Each time I woke with the same thought, I did this. I chose this. And now it's permanent. For the first time, I understood that a crime isn't just an event, it's a shadow that follows you everywhere, and sometimes, the shadow is heavier than the act itself. Morning didn't feel like relief, it felt like exposure. The sun streamed through the blinds, but instead of warmth, it highlighted every corner of the room, every little thing that could give me away. I sat on the bed, staring at the bag, and wondered how it could feel so light and heavy at the same time. Light because it was just a thing, heavy because it represented every risk I'd taken. I left the hotel cautiously, walking through streets that felt unfamiliar even though I'd checked maps a dozen times the night before. Every glance from a passerby set my nerves on fire. I kept telling myself I was invisible, that blending in was enough, but the tension never lifted. Freedom wasn't freedom, it was the ability to move without being stopped, which is very different from being unafraid. By midday, I realized something strange. I had succeeded. I hadn't been caught, questioned, or reported. But instead of celebration, there was a hollow, gnawing emptiness. The crime was over, but its echo had just begun. Success, I learned, doesn't erase fear, it amplifies it in silence. Days passed, and the initial panic faded just enough to let something else in: reflection. I kept replaying every detail, not out of fear of being caught, but because my mind needed to process the reality of what I'd done. Every decision, every tiny misstep I could have made, haunted me quietly. I realized that getting away wasn't the climax. It was the prologue to a life where every choice felt heavier. I avoided talking to anyone about it, even Marcus. Part of me wanted to brag, part of me wanted guidance, but mostly I feared what it would mean to put it into words. Words make it permanent, and I already felt the permanence in my chest. The memory of the flight, the border, the carousel, it all followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake, turning ordinary days into a constant, low hum of tension. I also noticed how much it changed me internally. Confidence, yes, but also hypervigilance, guilt, and a strange thrill that I hated and craved at the same time. I realized I had crossed not just a border, but a point of no return in how I saw myself. The person who had flown wasn't me anymore, or at least not the me I remembered. Looking back now, years later, I understand that this flight was never really about the money. It was about proving something, to myself, mostly, that I could act, that I could take a risk no one else would, and maybe even beat the system. And I did, technically. I got away. I crossed the border, returned home, and the package made it to its destination. But that success came with a cost I hadn't fully appreciated at the time. The fear, the guilt, the constant replay of every step, it didn't vanish. It became a quiet companion, always reminding me that choices have weight, and sometimes the consequences aren't legal or visible, they're psychological. I learned that thrill and terror can coexist, and that adrenaline can trick you into thinking you're invincible when you're really just human. If there's advice I can offer, it's this: shortcuts, no matter how clever, carry baggage you can't always see. The high of getting away fades, but the shadow sticks around. You can plan, you can execute, but you can't escape yourself. And that, I think, is the real cost of the crime.